preliminary concepts of how you would phase wellness, or how you would think that wellness was an important and overriding factor. But first, let us hear from our leader, co-president of the Club of Rome, who of course has been a leader in many more important fora than simply the Club of Rome, because she began as a young medical student in South Africa during the time that the activism about apartheid was beginning as a medical doctor, and she progressed in the Black consciousness movement to be able to set an underpinning concept which was taken up by many, including Mandela. And we heard about last summer about how he called for her to meet him in prison and his words to her. And then she became, of many things, out of the exile that she was sent into because of her agitation and prior to apartheid being removed. She received several various degrees, including public health, which should be interesting in this conversation, and anthropology, very important. She's received as managing director of the World Bank and as vice chancellor of the University of Cape Town, head of a political party in South Africa called AGANG, and of course, the many opinion pieces she has written about Africa, about the world, and about various oppressed people. She has received 8 honorary doctorates, many in the United States and North America. She's published 10 books. And the question is that this is just simply the paperwork about Mamfela, but she has a heart bigger than any of those accolades. And her impact on South Africa, women and children, particularly education, has been far greater than Wikipedia or any number of biographies could ever tell. And I'm very happy and honored. She said to me, come to South Africa. We were sitting in Mexico City. Come to South Africa and see what we're doing. So I went a year and 4 months ago. And indeed, I became so enthralled and engrossed that I've been working with them ever since. And so now Mamfela will tell us her concepts.
Thank you very much, Anitra, and thank you, colleagues, for inviting me again to your very active and lively network in the Western Hemisphere. You asked me to speak about reimagining regenerative wellness, and in a subtext of how do we transform education and learning. So my understanding of regenerative really is anchored on, regenerative wellness is anchored on the acute awareness that everybody, even the blindest mole, with COVID, we have come to grips with really how important wellness is, how important life is, over and above everything else. And when we talk about regenerative wellness, we're talking about an understanding that unless all are well, none is. And that's another lesson from COVID. And we also know from the multiple planetary emergencies that unless our ecosystems are well and regenerative, none of us will be well and have life to the full. And so I thought many people may feel this is too big a slice to take. I mean, how do you focus on well-being, regenerative well-being for everybody, and also add the ecosystem to it? I think if we remind ourselves that every little thing starts with what Margaret Mead talked about, of never doubting that a small group such as you, with your wonderful idea of thoughtful, committed citizens, can change the world. And it's the only thing that ever has. And I know this from my own country's experience. But I think it is also important for us to remind ourselves of where we come from as the Club of Rome, that we have always been at the forefront of shifting paradigms. People may condemn the limits to growth as a negative thing, but someone had to stop the runaway train that didn't think that there were any limits. So the limits to growth, which was published in 1972, as you know, was an important conversation in a world which just had no limits, didn't think that anything that we're using could ever come to an end. And the millions of copies that were sold bear no relationship to the impacts that the limits to growth has had on change in behavior. But we also were at the forefront in publishing no limits to learning. So in a sense, because learning is unlimited, the hope, which is why we are here today, is that we can use that capacity to learn to find the pathways to regenerative wellness for all people and for our planet. There is a question about why is there this gap between what we know and what we do. Aurelio Piche was when he departed, because he drew attention to what he called this human gap, the inadequacy of the human race to face up to the complexities of our life and our world, and to change our behavior accordingly. So knowledge doesn't necessarily lead to change in behavior. But the main recommendation of no limits to learning is that we should explore new ways of learning and the promotion of new approaches to education for both individuals and society. And I think, being a believer in the web of life that goes beyond the life of the physical body, I think Aurelio is here with us today and rather smiling with satisfaction that we are coming back to this theme. But when you first asked me through Anitra, you were rather focusing on reimagining regenerative wellness amongst the highly economically challenged peoples of the world. I mean, that's a good thought, to be mindful of those who have been left behind. But people are highly marginalized, not by accident. And the solution to marginalization doesn't lie with preaching or teaching or educating poor people. It lies at recognizing that there is a connection between the poor circumstances under which people live and the extraordinary accumulation of wealth in our community. And it was C.T. Corinne whom we quoted with Francis Wilson in 1989 when we wrote a book which remains sadly relevant to South Africa today, entitled Uprooting Poverty. We went through all the technical details coming from the lessons we had learned as activists and from the world about how we can uproot poverty. But because poverty is the carcass left over from wealth accumulation, unless the wealth accumulation process stops, you can't actually eradicate poverty. And we know, and I should know, having worked at the World Bank as a managing director for a good 4.5 years, the billions that we are pouring into uprooting poverty have had very little impact, with a few notable exceptions. And so the issue is, how can we, as the Club of Rome, which is a network of thoughtful, committed citizens, affirm this interconnectedness, the inextricable connectedness between people, and therefore the interconnectedness of the problems we are facing, including the multiple planetary emergencies that we face. And so we need to go back to basics. We have the benefit of insights of leading evolutionary ecologists who are coming around to saying the solution to our problems lie in studying the intelligence of nature. Because nature, we are the Latlamaki, we are a very new species compared to all the other life in nature. And so if you study nature, you will see that the wisdom of indigenous people, not only in Africa, but everywhere in the world, comes from their having studied this nature, to understand that we are inextricably interlinked, interconnected, and the best way forward is to support one another and to take care of our ecosystem. Carlos has done a great job of drafting a discussion document which speaks to the pillar of the Club of Rome's work of the Emerging New Civilization Initiative, to anchor our thinking about how do we emerge out of these planetary emergencies with a civilization, which is a new way of being human, that is much more a reflection of our understanding of the wisdom of nature. And so in that framing document, he goes back to our founder and repeats the words in No Limits to Learning forward, that this missing link in our ability as human beings to not only shift paradigms, but also shift our behavior and mindset, is the issue of the human gap. The distance between the capacity to cope with, to understand complexity and then to cope with it. I strongly recommend that as part of your exercise, you really draw on some of those documents which are on our website at the Club of Rome. I would be remiss not to bring you greetings from my sister co-president, Sandrine, who's very pleased to see, as we all are, that the Club of Rome members are much more active today than they were even 2-3 years ago. And so I'm very hopeful that what you are doing here is going to add value to our explorations of this learning how to become human in ways that are fitting for the moment we are in. So the question then at the beginning is, how should we go about exploring the regenerative learning and education models that we want to have, not just for schools, not just for young people, but for humanity. Because learning is a lifelong journey. And I would like to suggest that we learn from the work of Bruce Lipton and Stephen, who have written a book, which is an audio book called Spontaneous Evolution. I'm sure many of you have read it. Our Positive Future and a Way to Get There from Here. What struck me most in that book is their reference to imaginative, creative communities or minorities, which again goes back to the fact that although the Club of Rome has very small numbers of members, the impact we can have if we go about this exploration in by way of reimagining the future that can then bring forth branches that turn us from being individuals to being communities, then the impact will be much larger. And so I speak as Anitra said to you earlier, of lived experience of having started to shift paradigms in South Africa as a great unwashed student or small group of students in the late 1960s, we found ourselves in a place where the majority population in South Africa was regarded as the aberration from the norm, which was white. So we were called non-white. The norm, which was European, we were called non-European. And even because in segregated South Africa, our medical school was only for people who were regarded as non-white. And it was called the non-European section of the university. And we call ourselves non-Europeans. And this is the point about the journey that we should open our hearts to embracing. That any major paradigm shift starts with consciousness of the contradictions, the absurdities that we take as normal. I mean, for an African majority in South Africa to call itself non-European, it's so absurd. You can't imagine how people could do that, but we did. But by acknowledging the absurdity of it, you then can move to the next stage, which is to explore how to redefine yourself and your identity as an individual, as a community, and as a nation. So one has to have the courage, and this is another point that Bruce and Steve are making, that we tend to think that change emanates from intellectual understandings. Yes, it's very important to have the science and the technology and the conceptual understanding, but unless that is accompanied by a willingness to travel inside and confront the things that got Aurelio to speak about this human gap, what is it that's stopping us from doing what we know we should be doing? And in our case, what is it that stopped us from realizing how absurd it is to measure ourselves by a standard of people who are here to humiliate us and extract our wealth? So the practical elements of this journey of reimagining a regenerative education and learning process, I think from where I'm sitting has three elements. The first is the element of values. By what values are we judging what we are looking at? What is of value and what is valued and what is not and why? Which is why in our case, during those bad days, we went back to the wisdom of our ancestors. We realized that actually what we are looking for is right here, hiding in plain sight. That we were brought up to understand that a human being is co-substantial to others. And you can't, as a human being, live alone. You are not human unless you are connected to other human beings. So Ubuntu, which is so close to how the Buddhists look at it, most indigenous cultures have got different names for the same concept, which reflects this interconnectedness, interdependence, and the importance of always understanding, as evolutionary ecologists now are understanding, that the best life insurance for any species is an ecosystem that is populated by entities that usefully contribute to one another's well-being, to their sustainability. So if we want to have regenerative wellness, we've got to look at what are we contributing to creating a regenerative, well ecosystem where we are givers and not just takers, so that what we have can be sustained. The second element, practical element, is the issue of waking up to those things that hold us back. When you call yourself a non-European, you're already a negative. So you're starting with a deficit. Whereas when you say, I'm Black and I'm proud, I'm a woman and I'm proud, I'm an African and I'm proud, you are now drinking from the well of abundance. So the growth mindset that psychologists and other education specialists talk about, it's really about taking away, not allowing the constraints that we always put ahead of us. Either that, well, like we started the conversation with, saying things which may be politically controversial. So what? If what is going on is absurd, that's the name we should give it. We can't walk on eggshells when we are dealing with absurdity. And unless we call it by its name, it will always constrain us. So a growth mindset is a mindset also, particularly when we talk about my part of the world, where people have been told that to be Black is that you are less intelligent, you are less this, you are less that. Put that at the door, at the gate, and you'll see how you flower. And so, I mean, John Gilmore is here. He's actually created an education model that does just that. Kids in the worst living circumstances in South Africa are not saying, well, I'm only from Diepsloot. No, I'm from Diepsloot and this is what I would like to accomplish. And through mutual support, they are outperforming the rest of the public school system and some of the private school systems. So it is really about the willingness to confront the obstacles to the future that we would like to build. But that also brings us, the first element and the second element bring us to the third, which is about consciousness. That it's not just about being aware of or having values that, you know, this is what Ubuntu is about. South Africa is full of people who can give you a whole long lecture on Ubuntu, but it has not yet percolated into a way of life. It's not yet part and parcel of how they are, the way they construct, or as Anita's friend, Catherine, talked about this, composing a life. You compose a life which has got values that are appropriate, which has a growth mindset that doesn't allow any obstacles. But then you also need to move from being an individual to being a community. This is where consciousness raising is about building momentum for a movement. Whatever you are planning on having, unless there is a movement, even if it's a movement of small, imaginative, creative communities, you won't really see much of a difference. And I think that the Club of Rome, small as it is, if we operate at those three levels, great values that are linked to nature's wisdom, this not allowing obstacles to be placed on our path, and then working together to create a broader consciousness and a movement, then we can see the change. So what is this consciousness about? And again, going back to where I was very difficult when you are non-somebody. But when you are proud and you are confident, then you can say, who are you? Yes, in Africa, we even have totem animals and totem trees. So you can proudly proclaim yourself. And the other thing that this negativity brought were names that were supposedly Christian names. Forget that. I am Mampila, and this is the name that connects me to my ancestors. But the personal, intuitive consciousness of I am must also go to the I am human. And this is where those connections come in. But it's also being comfortable with the fact that you are not a brain, you are a spirit, a soul, a mind, a body, and all of that is intertwined. And so we need to examine the things that we are uncomfortable about, our feelings. We don't want to talk about feelings. We want to talk about what we know, but how do you feel? And you've got to be comfortable to know that there are feelings that you have, which are those obstacles that we were talking about earlier. And we need to, as part of the learning journey, is to learn to acknowledge those feelings and deal with them in a way that frees you to go to the next step. But then there is the social. As an individual, as I said earlier, you can't really have much of an impact. I'm human because of you, because of all of us. And in African languages, there's a beautiful way of expressing it, because when I meet you, I say, I see you. I'm not saying I see you physically with my eyes. I'm seeing, I'm apprehending your humanity. And then you say, yes, I see you too. And then we ask, talk of wellness, how are you? We don't say, what have you got? It's not the what, it's the how. And so this issue of how people feel and this wellness that embraces the physical, the spiritual, and the mind is very important. And of course, consciousness without action is dead. We have to use our newfound consciousness to reimagine and act in a way that brings about the change we would like to see. education systems won't change unless we participate in their change as grandmothers like me, or mothers, or professors at university, or teachers in schools. And that requires honesty and openness. And so I believe that we need to bring that back to spiritual consciousness. Because in the past, scientists thought that things of the spirit is just a waste of time. We really must focus on the real stuff of intellectual and scientific and technological advances. Yes, we have done that for I don't know how many centuries. We are back, we are now being drawn back to this neglected area of spiritual consciousness, where we can now, particularly in these very troubled times of losses and pain and suffering, to live in tune with a sense of gratitude and a set of greater possibilities. And that can only happen if we are sensing and feeling and living our connectedness. So I'm getting towards the end. What are the common features of consciousness raising in education models? If you look at, whether you're looking at LEAP or you're looking at other models, some of them predating LEAP, what are the key things? First, back to values. Values are really important to anchor what is it that we are learning? Why are we learning what we're learning? Because in my part of the world, in Africa, African languages are dying, and those who should be benefiting from them are bringing up children who don't know their roots. So values they go beyond what is counted as value. It is what make us whole and make us well and make our ecosystem well. Ecosystem well-being is not about technological advancement. It is about connecting all of those valuable things. But it is also, secondly, about creating strategies for development of a mindset that has shifted from looking at obstacles to looking at possibilities. And that, as a third point, requires a curriculum that is focused on liberating every one of us. And now back to South Africa, when you grow up in an environment where you're surrounded by poverty and you experience pain, it's really important that an education system deals with where you are at and helps to liberate you that you are more than the pain, you are more than the poverty, you are more than. And that's how John, for example, in his LEAP school has managed to do so well. But learning, however well anchored on values, etc., is not really going to be sustainable and regenerative unless we use communities where we find ourselves as learning laboratories. A lot of members of Club of Rome are professors at universities or are doing research. Wherever we are, that's the community. That's the laboratory where we can begin to practice and to explore this new way of learning. But again, looking at myself in my 70s, all this blah, 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 and this exploration, unless we bring in young people, is meaningless because we are already heading towards the departure lounge. So we need to think actively about bringing young people into the Club of Rome and into the work we do, into the networks, because they don't have to be in the Club of Rome, but in our networking, in this exploratory work of learning and educating and being educated, we need to focus on young people. Not only because there are more of them, but because of the issue of time, that they will be there to take this to where it should be. And so I believe that we have plenty of examples of what I'm talking about. But what we don't have is the capacity and the willingness to bring all of that into a network of networks so that we can seed the education systems in almost every country that were designed for the industrial age. And they're completely not fit for purpose for today's world. Yes, that doesn't mean the technical stuff has to all been thrown away, but technical stuff without being anchored in a values-based educational system is very problematic. The history we are teaching our children is very problematic. The languages that we use, very problematic. And of course, the ecosystems that we create for learning need to be radically changed. So I'm going to end with two questions which I'm putting to all of us. What role can we play in supporting models of education and learning that are self-liberating and that raise the consciousness of people as members of the Club of Rome? How can we be catalysts of new ways of teaching and learning? Second, as I said before, how can we leverage the presence of members of the Club of Rome in institutions of learning and research and policy making all over the world? How do we leverage our thematic work around issues of the planetary emergency action plans, reframing of economics, as you had from David last time, rethinking finance? I was very pleased to see they had the big boys on Wall Street being taken to the cleaners by small people, because it's a gamble. They just showed that this is really playing, gambling with people's money. So I have every trust that we can transform teaching, learning, and learn anew how to be human and how to be catalysts for a new way of being human, with a major focus on young people. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you, Mampela. Thank you so very much for a very, very inspiring talk on our subject, which is deep and complex as your own thoughts about this. And I'm wondering if anybody would like to attempt some response to either of her important questions. I'm looking at the chat box, and there have been people talking about other things, but perhaps Ndidi would like to, who's been very active on the chat box, would, Ndidi, if you could unmic yourself, would you like to respond to one or both of Mampela's questions about what role we can play in education, in the consciousness and other parts of education? And then perhaps John might try to make an answer. And Ndidi?
I'm right here. I was active in the chat box because some of the things Mampela said were just so inspiring that I thought I'm going to try and scribe them so that I don't forget. Now, I think that actually what we can do, again, I've spent the last few months really just learning, and I learn a lot from the sessions with Mamphela, and I think she's spoken to a lot of it. And one thing that's fascinating is just learning from the intelligence of nature. And you know, in the sessions we had with Nora Bateson last year, just that distinction between, you know, the map is not the territory. That comfort with really learning with all of our senses, and that, Mfela, what you spoke about, I see you, being able to see not just with our physical eyes, but really with our mind, our body, our soul. And I know that sounds really esoteric, but I think that, you know, as somebody who has been immersed in sustainability for a while, I think that as we see really this thinking, and I know if Carlos will look at me very, very badly right now, because he's going to say, and stop talking about the mainstream, but as we mainstream sustainability and ESG and everything that used to be so outside of the mainstream, as it becomes mainstream, if the voices of the Club of Rome who have been involved in this, not just with limits to growth and no limits to learning, and Mfela, I love the way you talked about, yes, we did talk about limits, but we talked about no limits as well. And I love the idea of the fact that we are a small group, but the multiplicity of impact that goes out from this single group is absolutely profound. And so it almost seems like it's an inward look and an outward look. It's learning intelligently from nature. It's building these networks among ourselves that are, on the one hand, very focused on a particular geographical area, but then on the other hand, recognizing that the web is really one that is endless and continuous, and interplays with one another. I think in the Africa group, we've looked specifically at what John is doing in terms of the LEAP schools, and we're asking ourselves, how do we take what has worked in one ecosystem and multiply that effect? And I think, you know, Carlos's work on the fifth element, and specifically, I think what we're discussing at the moment is, how do we take the emerging new civilizations thinking within the Club of Rome and our focus on the youth, which is really the future generation, the next generation, alternative thinking, and bring that into everything that we do? And how do we take learning, and I'll stop here, outside of the classroom and outside of the structured educational systems as we know them, and really infuse them into everything? So the question is, how do you create no structure and yet create a structure around no structure? It's a bit of a conundrum, and I think the answer to that is, you know, I'll end with the same way as you have I see you in Swahili. In Igbo,
John, can you briefly unmute yourself? And I know you could talk for 2 hours about this, but what role can we, to answer her second question, play in education of consciousness and this first question which Mamphela posed? Thank you.
Certainly. Ndidi, I'm sorry, did you want to just finish that line, or are we okay?
So in Igbo, it's the same thing. I love you means I look in your eyes, I look in your soul. So love, just the principle of love. Thank you, John. Thank you. And sorry, Anitra, I went on for a bit. Thank you.
I'm sorry, it's going on and off. So I'm getting some of the sentence and then not another part of the sentence. My apologies to you and Didi.
I've been thinking quite a lot about, you know, any input today on the back of that very beautiful input from Mamphela and now from Ndidi. So I've just put something on visual to just prompt some thinking, if you don't mind. Just bear with me on this. I've been asking myself the question, so what is this thing called wellness that we're aspiring to? You know, we're talking about wellness. And if I'm to explain it to a child in grade 10, you know, what is wellness? I'm not sure that I'm really good at that yet. So I need, as a practitioner, to be able to do my description to a child. Then I know that I've got it clear for myself. And, you know, one of the things that I've been thinking about this week is that we keep measuring what other people think that matters, and we don't measure what we know really matters. So we've got to get to be able to determine, in the concept of wellness, what really matters, and how do we learn to really measure what really matters so that we can actually start to quantify it and celebrate it and promote. And so as I thought about my answer to the child, I came up with my, tapped into what I know, which could be dangerous, but it's wellness is more process than outcome. It's more journey than destination, but it does include the right or the freedom with the choices and the opportunities to participate in the processes of discovering wellness for ourselves, for each other, and for our natural world. So once I've got that separated, I realize that I'm not going to quantify wellness in terms of material factors. I'm going to quantify wellness in terms of process factors. But then I ask myself, what does that look like and what does that feel like? So I wanted to show you some of my experiences. So when I look at what is not wellness, I see limited learning, limited personal growth, and limited wellness. When I look at another view of people from the same place, I see wellness. I see in the left-hand picture, a young child liberated to be able to use technology in limited but liberating way. There's joy, there's warmth, there's a strong sense of belonging, and there's a sense of a future in which he or she has the right to participate. The picture on the right shows me a different kind of wellness where because the electricity has been cut, which happens regularly in our country as they do what they call load shedding, guess what happens to the cell phones? They become the light by which we study. And those cell phones become multi-purpose things because we are discovering our wellness. There are no limits to learning. We can be intrinsically driven, and there are no limits to personal growth. The wellness can also be translated in the Ubuntu language to the picture on the left, where young students at the age of about 17 or 18 are caring for children in a daycare center where there's not much care. So my wellness is because of your wellness. And on the right-hand side, a young person planting a carbon sequestering plant, and there my wellness is because of the wellness of nature, and nature's wellness is because of me. If I can participate in those processes, I am discovering wellness. Of course, my wellness, as Mampela pointed out right at the beginning of her presentation, needs to be rooted in historical and cultural coherence, and it needs to be, understand that I'm interdependent. I'm human because of you, and your caring reflection shapes who I am. If I just take a model that we've developed at LEAP, it is the model of moving from taking, the immaturity at the bottom of the arrow, from becoming unconscious subjects waiting to be led, to becoming mature subjects, citizens walking together, actively engaged in leadership. That's the activation as fully conscious citizens. And for me, that process is the process of coming to wellness, and it's a lifelong process. So that's all I wanted to share. Thank you.
Carlos, would you like to say a few succinct words and then mute yourself, please?
I think there are other people in the list before me.
Yes, okay, Julia.
Thank you, Anitra. Yeah, I just want to respond to a few things. One was that I think this shift in consciousness is connected to the well-being and the wellness. So on the one hand, there is a systems issue around new measurements, which we're also working on with Club of Rome. But we all know that new measurements mean nothing unless there's a shift in consciousness as well. So the two are very connected. In the work that I've been doing, I've been seeing it coming together in an interesting way. And I'm really appreciative of Mampela for bringing the word spirituality into the room, because it's not just an intellectual exercise, shifting consciousness, as we know. There's an interesting moment we're in right now where science and spirituality are starting to come together again after a very long divide. And it's in an interesting way in things like neuroscience, where we're seeing, for example, what happens when we train teachers through mindfulness to overcome unconscious racial bias. There's interesting research being done on that. The importance of awareness so that we know when we're being manipulated by advertisement and by social media. Another human skill, connection, overcoming loneliness, developing altruism, the Ubuntu mindset. These are not things that we can leave to chance. Now they can be brought into the education system in a secular way because there's good science to it. So I think these wisdom traditions have been saying it for a long time, but there have been a lot of barriers and sensitivities because it's too culturally specific. Now there's an opening because of science to do that in a secular way. I also think that we can do that with adults. I completely agree with Mampela that we need to reach the young children, but I'm increasingly being asked to speak to business leaders and to people in banking and finance, not because they want to change the economic system, but because they're suffering. They're going through so much stress right now. And so I'm using that as a door to introduce these skills. I talk about them as well-being and resilience skills. But my secret agenda is that once they start to connect with these feelings of how isolated they are from each other and their communities, the real dissonance they feel that they know about climate change, but every day they go to work and they're making it worse. If I can give them the emotional and meditative skills to hold that dissonance, I'm starting to introduce donut economics, new beyond GDP measures, because that's where they need to take that courageous step in shifting the system. So I think that the way that we hold meetings and convene at the Club of Rome can no longer be PowerPoints and intellectual conversation. We can weave in very skillfully and in a secular way how we relate to each other, how we can connect to nature again. I bring in nature in all of my programs with leadership. I get them to take off their shoes and reconnect to nature. I teach them basic mindfulness skills. I get them to reflect on compassion. So that's one aspect of the consciousness shift that we now have permission because of neuroscience and other fields to start bringing in without shyness into the way that we work. The second aspect, I think, is around shifting the narrative. And this comes back to Mampela's observation that we shouldn't talk about it as just being for the poor or for the wealthy. Again, because of good research, and I'm thinking about Wilkinson and Pickett and the spirit level, we know that rising inequality is bad for the wealthy as well as the poor. So the well-being narrative isn't, right now, is about what do we have to lose from the wealthy and privileged perspective? What do we have to lose if we shift towards more equality and more sustainability? It isn't the real narrative because we are losing. The wealthy are also losing because of the current economic situation. So we shift the narrative to what do we all have to gain by doing the right thing? So many of the people I'm speaking to in very privileged positions are facing anxiety, social breakdown, more instability if they keep on the current course, climate breakdown that is increasing their financial risk, and people in everyday life are feeling that. So I think the narrative around well-being, the consciousness shift is that we will all gain. And well-being is not a zero-sum equation. You know, it's not my well-being will go down if I move to increase well-being of others. So I think that's also part of the consciousness shift that we can now support with facts.
Thank you very much, Julia. I have to tell everybody that Julia is from Bhutan, and she is an advisor on wellness to the Bhutan government. And I want to say personally to Julia that I take my students and they all have to get their hands in the muck and plant something. It's amazing what a lawyer or a businessman or someone feels when they've planted something important in the sea and then see it growing and see the sea revitalizing itself. It's just a miracle to them. and no matter if they're an attorney or a physician or whoever they are, a businessman. The next is Carlos, and that's followed by Marilyn and then Herbie. So if you'd prepare yourselves, Carlos, some succinct remarks about Mampela or our general concept.
Succinct but provocative, I hope. Because, I mean, Mampela was great, as she always is, you know, with the elegance, warmth, and substance of her speech. And she asked two questions. What role can we play? How can we leverage our presence? And I noticed the conversation immediately went into in a running mode of let's get to the mainstream. How can we define and measure wellness? Please hold on the horses, you know, because why do we need to define? Why do we need to measure? Defining and measuring is part of the mindset which got us into this mess from the very beginning. It's an exercise of separation of ourselves from an object, which we call wellness, and let's look at it from the outside and let's try to measure it. This is very much the epistemology of rationalism and the Enlightenment. And that epistemology has not been useful. I mean, it has been useful for certain purposes, but it has created the mess in which we are. And I would argue that what we have to do is to define and measure wellness, because actually the most important things in life, you don't have to define them. You cannot. You simply cannot define them. Try to define love, which is exactly the same exercise. Try to define love. What you do with love is, besides practicing it, hopefully, you write pieces of art, or in any way of artistic expression, you try to capture a bit of its essence. So I think the essence of what we are talking about is already very well represented in the Ubuntu philosophy. So the very interesting fact about what Mampela said is that we don't actually need to define our values or the values we want to cherish and then to measure them, because this is basically impossible. This is defining and measuring what is most important is exactly an operation of going from the territory and the richness of the territory to a map. And a map is always an operation of reductionism. But we have Ubuntu, and the answer is, it was also put in one of the slides of John, my wellness is because of your wellness. So we don't need new research. We don't need research at all. We know since the beginning of times that wellness is dependent on the quality of our relationships, is our relationships, period. So what we have to do, I think, that's my point, is to make this very simple idea, and provocative idea that what we need is Ubuntu is the recognition at a much more massive scale than today that wellness is our relationships, and that this is not an exercise of defining and measuring it. It's an exercise of learning together how to practice that philosophy.
Thank you very much, Carlos. Marilyn, would you like to give us some thoughts about the educational part of Mampela's?
I'd like, excuse me, Mampela, that was wonderful. I feel like I'm finally swimming in a pool of people with whom I feel so connected. And when I looked at what we were discussing and the question being asked of us, I couldn't help but think back to the work that I've done with children in the United States and in 74 countries. And we started homeschooling, which was very, very negatively met at the time and has now been transitioned into an idea whose time has come. And so I began to think, well, all the things that Mamphela has been talking about, values-based, activating, consciousness, curriculum, are the ideas that for me were condensed into a school that was based on the concept, that is based on the concept of protecting every being's consciousness. And so my thought was, are we the network of networks from which to begin this process? In my experience, I haven't experienced another network similar to CORE that is doing the work in the way that we're doing it, and that I could jump in and participate and contribute. And perhaps it is our game, it is our journey, since it's already so much a part of whom we are, rather than, and I'm always looking at how to bring it forward. So I was thinking, if we are, perhaps we are the network of networks, and perhaps we begin by designing our simple operating statement. Perhaps it's being done too by Carlos in New Civilizations, rather than aligning with and starting another organization. And then we align with the leaders, with the youth in our community, to whom we're already discussing this to galvanize our program. We work on the work we're doing, but we have a beautiful, lovely feedback to the process by going back to whom we are and who we work with in ways that we've never done before. For example, I got on the phone last night with our girls in Afghanistan that I work with. And this concept is virtually unknown. There was no framework for them there yet to work on this, but they loved it. They were scared, but they liked the idea of a new way of thinking, of leadership, of wellness. And so I think we have this rich field within to work, and I'd like to see us cultivating this and continuing to use this as our springboard, creating our plan, or not a plan, but our modeling statement, using Ubuntu and using the work that has been done by so many amazing organizations around the world who just need perhaps us to bring this together into a cohesive whole.
Thank you, Marilyn. The next person is Herbie. Can you unmute yourself, Herbie? You're still, yes, thank you.
Well, you know, if our starting point at the Club of Rome is that we're in a planetary emergency, then of course, that must be our ultimate focus, the key focus on which we start. That, in terms of education, of course, leads us to try and answer the question, who are we? And there, the reality is that we are totally different from the indigenous people that we've heard about so eloquently from Mamphela. We are what I call the amplified man, and I emphasize the word man because we are amplified through technology as we've never been before in human history. So each one of us in Europe, for instance, burns about 6,000 watts of energy. In America, Australia, that figure is maybe twice as much as that. So that defines us more than anything, who we are in terms of ultimately the impact that we have on the global environment. Then we have, of course, become urbanized people as never before, which has major implications in terms of resource use. So if we are serious about living in an urbanizing world, we better get an understanding of how our consumption patterns, which are amplified through urban living, you know, impact distant ecosystems. I've done a lot of work recently on the impact of Chinese cities, for instance, on the animal in terms of consumption patterns, particularly soya beans for animal feeds, you know, used in Chinese. So where do we go from here? We need to really be much clearer about our place in nature. So we are totally different from indigenous people in terms of these impacts. I have the good fortune of living on the edge of a forest in South Wales, and so often, in most days, in fact, I go forest walking. So I'm just putting together a lecture which I call Learning the Forest as Teacher, you know, the understanding of ecosystems. The forest does not need people. It exists by itself. It rather likes to shed people if it can. So what is the implication of that for the future of life? We are continuously destroying forests rather than regenerating. And really, in our starting point in our work, we need to start with the cycles of nature, the water cycles, the nutrient cycles, the carbon cycles. Once we have a better understanding of that really big picture, how we in our daily lives and our economic activities interfere with those cycles, those are the kind of starting points in education, I think, that are of critical importance for future generations. And I don't want to go on much longer because I think certainly there's so many other people who like to speak. But I'd just like to draw your attention to the wonderful young American poet Amanda Gorman, who spoke at Biden's inauguration, who has written a great poem about, you know, the planet on which we live and how we need to find totally different ways of relating to it. So the voices of young people in some ways are becoming much more important than the voices of people like us, who are the Club of Rome and all the people you represent. Certainly, though, the issue of Ubuntu and I am who you are and how we relate to each other is the critical issue at this moment in time. It's about learning by doing, as we've heard from Anitra, rather than just abstract learning. But we certainly need to find new ways of online education as well in this context. So certainly at the Club of Rome, we need to discuss how we can better influence young people through online learning process than we currently do. That's all I want to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Herbie. Now I'm going to call on David Pollack, followed by Bill Reese, followed by John Richardson. So if you would unmic yourselves. David.
Yes, thank you, Anitra, and for the invitation to join the group. I'm coming to you, speaking to you from Canada today, where I worked a number of years ago with a colleague, some of you will know, Mark Anielski, on doing a genuine progress indicators piece for the province of Alberta with 52 different indicators. And since that time, Mark has progressed to the insight that he thinks it's very important as to who gets to define wellness. Vis-a-vis Carlos's point, what Mark is doing now is working with a great number of Indigenous communities in Canada and facilitating processes where the people themselves define, through answering various questions, what is most important to them in their own community. What do they value the most? What brings them the greatest happiness? What brings them the greatest sense of safety? And so that you will find in one community or another that relationships always stands out, the question of safety at night, the question of educational possibilities, the sense of being able to make a living. And then in terms of some of the existential battles that we are facing globally, depending on the community you are in, if you were in the north, you will find nearly all the communities will worry about the permafrost or the rise of sea levels. And I'm just suggesting that if you did a number of these local exercises globally through a network, eventually you would bring in all the great existential factors that climate change presents to us, for example, and the distribution of wealth questions and inequality questions, all would come out in these sort of local community exercises. And the reason that I think that some of these definitions are important to define, in fact, is because that allows one to build a common understanding from individuals. It creates a community sense when the exercise is done communally. It can then lead to recommendations for policy changes that the community wants, whether it's at a local level or a provincial or state level. And it also then allows for people not only knowing that policy and the advice, but to advocate for it. And so I think this approach of multiple opportunities for smaller groups in communities to do their own definitions of the indicators for them that mean wellness is a much superior process than having us, not us, but people generally try to academically define for others what wellness is. So I just commend that approach to us and think that in fact both the national associations and the Club of Rome itself could be very good as a consolidator of research and to develop networks of networks. So that's the comment I bring to you today, to do that local process. But whatever we do, we can't leave out the identification of existential indicators for the ones that really need to be attended to. But they will come out as we investigate with local communities globally what brings them the best sense of wellness and safety. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. Next, we're going to hear from Bill Reese from KCOR, and then followed by John Richardson, followed by Tom Powers, followed by Ryan Jackson. So if you'd all get your unmuted selves. Bill?
Thank you very much, Anitra. I'd like to go back to a number of things that others have touched on, primarily the role of education and the youth. And I want to share a couple of slides that I prepared for a completely different purpose earlier this week. And I'll start with this one. What we have to recognize is the contributions of what is really cognitive neuroscience. And what we have learned in the last couple of decades is that people acquire a cultural paradigm, a cultural narrative, a tribal narrative, it doesn't really matter, but simply growing up within a particular cultural context and hearing the same kinds of ideas repeated over and over again literally helps shape the synaptic circuits of the person's brain, so that we develop habitual thought patterns. And this was highly adaptive when we were pre-agricultural, let us say, because it created a sense of cultural unity, it created a sense of personal identity, because we had acquired the meaning, as it were, the profound understandings of our own particular culture. But we've retained this today. Modern people are not confronted with, but imbued with the same neural circuitry, or at least the way it's formed, as we have all along. The problem here is that once you have acquired a particular way of seeing the world, then, and I'm going to quote here, when faced with information that does not agree with our preformed internal circuits, we tend to deny, discredit, reinterpret, or forget that contrary information. So the idea that a cultural worldview becomes literally embedded in the brain becomes the means by which we seek out experiences that reinforce how we already think. And we're seeing that in spades in the way that the internet and social media enable people to talk to each other in echo chambers that simply reinforce which they already believe. But it's also the source of denial of any contrary information. And this is causing a tremendous disruption in the way which the world operates. And of course, it's a huge barrier to our coming together around any common sense of our belonging in nature, for example. It is the source of climate denial. It is the source of science denial. And I'll move on here. I think this is a brilliant cartoon that captures it all. That if you think of the gentleman speaking as the mainstream, there's the Club of Rome and some of our acolytes standing at the table. The problem with your reasoned solutions is that they don't fit my preconceived notions of the problem. And of course, that's exactly right. Nothing we have been saying, it conforms to the cultural paradigm that drives the world today. And I'll dissolve it down to the idea of perpetual material growth, driven in fact by unlimited technological expansion. It gets worse than that, because in the last 40 or 50 years, we've seen a purposeful intention to redefine political discourse around new ideas that are completely untrue. So people are attracted to these ideas, the reassuring lies, and we deny the inconvenient truth. So much is this a problem that the Oxford dictionaries defined post-truth as the word of the year in 2016. And this is relating to or denoting circumstances in which objective facts are less influential in shaping public opinion than our appeals to emotion and personal belief. So again, I want to emphasize that we are up against a culture which is now purposefully trying to recreate a new paradigm that is absolutely opposed to that which we speak of daily. Now, it's been going on for some time. I meant to skip this one, but we're entering an endarkenment. Certainly the Enlightenment had some useful attributes, but the endarkenment is going to be a much worse situation. But here's what I really want to get at. This is a slide that I've adapted from a number of places, but it shows the steady uptick in carbon dioxide emissions over the past, 50 or 60 years or so. And it also locates a number of very important global events. We've had 34 climate conferences. We've had 6 major agreements by the international community on how to reverse this trend. In 1972, the Limits to Growth was published. In 1992, the first of the world scientists' warning to humanity, of which there's been several since, have been published. And my point in showing this is that none of these things have any effect whatsoever on the actual trajectory of modern civilization. And I would argue it's because of the inordinate success of the right wing of our political discourse around the world in inculcating the neoliberal economic paradigm based on perpetual growth and continued technological progress is spreading throughout the world. And all of these events based on a contrary perception have had absolutely no effect. So it's extremely important, if we go back to this first slide, to recognize the role of education in creating in people's minds that new set of beliefs, values, assumptions, and facts upon which a new world in which humans do find themselves or feel themselves in their bones as a part of nature becomes a fact of our new cultural paradigm. But we're up against this enormous machine that keeps reinforcing the synaptic circuitry, as it were, that we carry with us in the world today, and which is in fact resulting in our destruction, despite the best science, despite the best philosophy, despite the pleas of such organizations as the Club of Rome. This is the trajectory we are on. And we have to face that reality and recognize that it leaves us rather little time to talk about changing the nature of the realities that people experience. So I'll stop my share at that point.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you very much. And next we'll hear from John. John, could you unmute yourself? John, could you unmute yourself?
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
So, in the end, what we have is like one person power to do whatever we're going to do. And I just want to give a couple of examples of the micro and the macro. The first is that about young people. So I decided in 2 academic appointments to live with students. So I lived in American University's largest undergraduate dormitory and gave lectures and cooked dinners for students, including being featured on the Style Channel, My Celebrity Home. And then in addition to that, simultaneously, and I did that for 9 years. And then in Singapore, again, I lived with students for about 5 years, living in an undergraduate dormitory in an apartment where they could come and knock at my door every day. And the question, and I found that useful to bring this kind of anthropological field perspective to what I was doing at the same time, not all that usual, was working with the Prime Minister's office of the government of Singapore, which was not all that consequential, and talking about the kind of issues that we are talking about. So I think there's a place, and some of you have done this as well, for listening to students and sharing their lives over extended periods of time, listening to young people and sharing their lives over extended periods of time, and then struggling with that perspective to make the kind of compromises and deal with the kind of challenges that you deal with as you're working at fairly high levels with different governments, which I've done both in the United States and in Singapore, and also in Sri Lanka. And the question is, how can we bring the authenticity, as you've tried to do as well, of young people, but if working with government involves compromises and winning acceptance and treating that as an opportunity for field research, it can be challenging, but I think getting into the muck of that, and I don't mean that the Singapore government or other governments I've worked with were muck at all, but I think that's a challenge. And I just want to give one more example and then I'll stop. So in an earlier life, I wrote my dissertation and wrote a book on how we took the ideas of agricultural extension and promoted them in a number of countries all over the world, what was called the University Contract Program, working with universities and at the same time, for about 10 years, my family and I lived on a farm. So on the one hand, I was writing about agricultural extension and promoting it in government, and then I would go home and my daughter was involved in the dairy judging program at the university, in Ohio. And so I think spending a lot of time wearing muddy boots, which is what agricultural extension agents do, or wearing the muddy boots of actually getting into the middle of government decision processes with the knowledge and experience you bring. Learning about students by wearing the muddy boots of living with students over extended period of time, and then bringing that to government consulting and work with governments, even though there are costs and trade-offs as well to doing that. So I think this is a very bright group and we have different roles, but I think actually working with governments, even though there's some cost to that at different levels, can have value.
Thank you very much, John. That's very interesting. Dr. Tom Powers, would you please unmute yourself?
Hello, hello everyone. Hello, Anitra.
Hi.
First and foremost, I want to thank you, Anitra, for inviting me to participate. I'm really a newbie to the core organization, but I really appreciated Fala's eloquent discussion earlier in the meeting. I have only a couple of things to say. I still, I have kind of like one foot still in the canoe. I'm involved with a wellness committee for the Alameda Contra Costa County Medical Society. And what we're doing is very simple. We're dealing with an immediate problem, which is burnout of physicians. And we have created a structure so that any healthcare provider doesn't have to be a doctor, doesn't have to be a member of the organization, but anyone experiencing burnout can get help so that they can continue to function in this incredibly harrowing situation we have, especially in California. I also have a couple of things to say about the discussion. I want to thank Mamphela for the best laugh of the morning when she described truly how the big boys in Wall Street had been taken to the cleaners, and that is so true. However, I fear that whatever their garments are coming back from the cleaners, there may remain a few stains that have to be worked on. Yeah, I think you know, the enormity of the problem is such that we have to devolve to the microcosm, to the, you know, to the community we live in, the people we work with. That's all I can do. My community of professionals, my children, I have 3 children. One is a surgeon, the other is a gynecologist, the other is a environmental engineer, and then I have my one is a daughter-in-law of the gynecologist, and then my daughter's nutritionist, and they're all in the foxholes, and I keep them supported as much as I can. But we have an ongoing war, and it's not just a matter of changing the parameters and the structure, but we really have to come to grips with the fact that what we had seen and in some ways lavishly enjoyed earlier in this lifetime, it's just not going to work for the future. And how we come to grips with that is a very daunting question. But I want to thank you all, and I appreciate being able to participate, and I look forward to continuing participation. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom, so much. Ryan, Dr. Ryan Jackson, our host, who's a member of CORE and on the board of USACORE.
I'm actually going to give a couple of minutes to Dr. Sharon Martinson for her to say something, and then I'll finish.
Oh, she was going to be after you immediately, but that's fine.
Okay. I'll follow her.
All right. Sharon?
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm Sharon. I have not met any of you except in person, Ryan, and a long time ago, Anitra. I'm here in Wyoming. I am a scientist. I'm also a musician, and thank you for letting me be part
Sharon,
of
could you speak slightly louder for we old ones?
Sure, I can give that a try.
Because we can't hear you. Thank you.
Is that better?
A little.
Oh.
It could be better than that.
I'm sorry. Let me check my mic level. You know what, Ryan, go ahead. I'm going to see if I can adjust my mic level on this.
Okay, yeah, it's just faint. But, all right, so I'll talk a little bit. So I've been hosting these meetings for the past several months while we've been locked down with COVID, and we've had some excellent speakers over these several meetings. But the main thing is we need to get people who have different perspectives and different expertises to be able to play nicely and be able to deal with some of these difficult issues. Because too often we have people that only deal with one tiny aspect, and while you deal with that aspect, you can end up causing 5 other problems. And so that's why we need to get the different perspectives. And I think it's great to have these small group discussions so we can actually have some interaction and hear from people. And we're dealing with people all over the world in many different time zones. Some of you were on the call I had at 5 a.m. today. But this is the way we need to have these discussions. And at some point, I think we can bring in people with connections in other fields who have very different perspectives to see if we can try to either shift theirs or have them shift ours, so that we can get somewhere in this. Because right now we have a lot of money being thrown into opposing these projects. And so now we need to figure out how we can get some real action done and have some real influence in the world. All right. Sharon, would you like to speak?
Have we solved your...
You guys let me know. I just,
that's
I
wonderful.
just changed my microphone. Good. Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you for letting me join you today as an outsider coming in. Really enjoyed the discussion. Thank you, Mampala, for an excellent conversation starter with this. I am a scientist, I'm a musician, I live in Wyoming, and I've been following many of the things that Club of Rome has held as core values for actually a long time now. So it's fun to get to be part of this. As a scientist, I keep hearing us talk about looking to nature and studying nature for understanding how some of these processes work and our interconnectedness. And that's absolutely amazing and wonderful and beautiful in every way. And that deeply inspires me. But I also wanted to just give the other side of that perspective a little bit and think that maybe we can also learn from that. Nature is what we think of it as this beautiful woven web of interconnectedness and things being related to each other in terms of total wellness, right? And that's lovely. And that's a great perspective to have. But the other side of that, which is maybe less comfortable and less lovely, is also competition and the individual's desire on a genetic level to eke out their best living ahead of anyone else, right? Competition is very much at the base of so much of science. And so even though it's all interconnected, it's not that there's not tension there between the different entities. And so part of what I was thinking about when we've all been talking about wellness is also resilience. And from an ecosystem perspective, resilience very much occurs when an ecosystem is full of many players which are interconnected, right? You think about a barren wasteland, you get invasive species or a few that come in and take over and it's a terrible disaster. But an ecosystem that is resilient has many players and it looks like they're all interconnected, and they are, but it's not necessarily without each of them having their own needs. And I think as humans and being part of ecosystems, we have an interesting perspective because we can see and we know that our needs can be met and that we're connected to all the other entities, be it other people in our world or other parts of nature and our planet. When all of these are having needs that are met, the resilience occurs. And so we can have a positive impact by taking a step back from the very myopic goals of evolution, which is linearly increasing ourselves and only caring really about ourselves, and recognizing that the only way to move forward is to expand your vision to recognize when the needs of other things that are connected to me and other things around me are also well, and we don't have to define well, we know well, just like we know, like Carlos said, we know when we have love, we know when we are well. When all of those other things are met, those other needs are met, then we can actually be in a much more resilient place. And resilience isn't stasis, and interconnectivity isn't stasis. It's always movement, and it's always the connectivity, but all of the needs being met together creates that resilience. Yeah, Mampala, if she wants to unmute, it looks like she has a quick question for me. But
Mampala, do you wish to speak? You're muted. Mampala, you're still muted.
I was simply indicating to Anitra to call me after you're finished. I don't want to interrupt.
Okay. And I'm almost done. I just have one more quick observation, and that's from the other side of my brain that is all connected. And that is thinking about learning and changing the way we have these learning systems that, as we know, have worked well for industrial revolution and extractive industries. And moving forward, at some pace, whatever direction forward is by some metric, but revitalizing and re-acknowledging the importance of creativity and learning creativity. And I teach some courses on cultivating creativity in learning, because often we think of learning as this very linear and additive accumulation of knowledge. And yet we move forward in the greatest leaps when creativity is fostered. And it is something that's learned. It can be learned and it can be fostered. And so just the importance of fostering and cultivating creativity in all that we do and in all that we try to move, you know, in other groups forward with, really prioritizing creativity, because that's where you get these leaps outside of just the additive accumulation of knowledge. So with that, thank you for letting me be part of this. It's been fascinating.
Thank you, Sharon. Mampela, did you want to comment on that?
I want to comment on what people have been saying, particularly picking on what Ryan is pleading for, that we can have all these conversations, so what, in the end? And I think here, when you look at what Carlos has done in that big framing document about how do we learn new ways of being human, and the references to the relational side of us, which has been neglected. Yes, Sharon, being a scientist is very important. And what I love about it is that some of the top scientists, when they came in towards the waiting room, they became so passionately spiritual because they'd neglected, they'd switched off that sensitivity. Now, what we are pleading for here is that that resilience you're talking about comes from being whole and not leaving your brain or your soul or your heart somewhere else. And I think that's what we are learning from nature. We're not saying nature is idealistic in every way, but there are lots of things we can learn from. But I also want to get back to the issue that was raised about, are we a network of networks? Absolutely. I mean, I've been so thrilled, particularly this Western Hemisphere has used this networking process very effectively, Anitra, I must say, you and your colleagues. Brian. And I think it is very, very important that we recognize that the power of the Club of Rome comes from it being a network of networks. And that networking is both local, where we are with those local communities, and across the globe. And I think one of the wonders or the benefits of COVID is how we've become alive to this way of meeting, which we didn't use in the past. And I think networking is much easier now with this power of online work. And so I think the power of networks, it lies in being able to get the different perspectives together, people doing different things from different angles, whether you're working with youth or with policymakers, and we harvest the movement impact of this way of working. In the Africa region, we have actually started an exercise which I would ask you to think about exploring, of each one of the members doing you are a creative person, doing a spider web of their network of networks, and then bring that into the network of networks I think there is a lot more that we can leverage out of our collective network of networks and the diversity of the strengths we bring to really have the movement impact that is the way to start shifting paradigms and mindset. I don't think lectures are going to do it. We have tried that. Books are going to do it. We have tried that. But I really think that there is power in this concept of network of networks, which is why I think I would like to provoke Carlos in talking about his idea of 10,000 communities. When you think about each one of us here is working with a number of communities. Now imagine if we were to network all these communities, the impact of it would be amazing.
So
thank you very much. As usual, very inspiring. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the chair's prerogative and tell you my concept of wellness and ecosystems. And then I'm going to turn it over to Ted Manning, with David Corton being the wrap-up and telling us, each one of them, how they see what has happened with the concept during this very, very rich period, where we want to thank each and every one of you for your important contributions, particularly Mampela, who had an extraordinarily rich contribution. But David and Ted have been working very hard, along with myself, on trying to bring this concept, a meta concept, together. But I'm going to put my 2 cents worth in about the ecosystems and then hand it over to Ted, who hands it over to David, and I think we'll be out of time by then. But to make it very simple, I think Mampela's concept of Ubuntu also originally related to humans being related to their ecosystems, at least to the fish, the animals, the plants, the trees that they used, the water, perhaps, the air, and the soil, in which agriculture being 15,000 to perhaps 100,000 years old, where you took wild plants and just put them in your backyard and grew them so you'd have food continually. And many tribes, like the Native Americans, prayed to the buffalo they were going to kill, or the bear or moose they were going to kill, and said, I need this to feed my family. So there was an interaction between the ecosystem sustainability and the people. But in the Greek sense, and probably before that in the Phoenician and Assyrian sense, we began dividing things up: body, mind, spirit, and God and man. And so nature got separated completely from mankind, so that now people live in large urban centers and children don't even know that they're related to the berries that grow on trees in the ecosystem. But I started and come from the Yale School of Forestry, which has been a leader for 125 years in restoration of ecosystems. But this is a very old concept, and people have been doing this along with agriculture for thousands of years. So there's a very rich and well-known restoration of ecosystems, which is in no way being utilized appropriately, except by a few big lumber companies who want to restore their own asset, and rules that various governments have for mitigation, but it isn't anything close to appropriate. And most countries do not have a national ecosystem restoration. And what happens when you do the restoration is the animals come back into this habitat free of charge. So when I restore my seagrasses, I get tens of thousands of animals almost immediately in juvenile form coming back in. And it makes resilient the sediment at the bottom, it cleans the water, and does a host of services for mankind. But men haven't, and I say men very specifically because I believe that's who's mostly in Wall Street and the captains of industry and on their boards, have not gotten the connection and have not indulged their philanthropy arms into helping the balance of nature. And I ask, how secure can mankind be on an insecure Earth with insecure ecosystems? That's my following question. So now I hand everything over to Ted Manning, who will hand it over to David Korten. Ted?
Thank you very much, Anitra. And well, as we said, we're all in this together. This is, I think this is exactly what we wanted to make happen. And I was very happy that we didn't even have to moderate. You guys wanted to talk to each other, and we felt that that would be the best way to make this go. I run participatory processes all around the world. I've done them in over 150 countries, and mainly dealing with small communities and try to get people to actually define what they think well-being really means, so that then we can try and devise programs and support educational programs, new training, anything that's required, totally holistic. And so I learned something today from every single one of you. And that's really why we invited you, was we thought we each had something useful to tell each other. We are hoping that this will generate a continuing forum that involves all or most of you. And in fact, we've talked a little bit about running them every month or so like this. And we've prevailed on Carlos perhaps to be the speaker for the next one. We also are asking you the question of how do you want to do this? I mean, each of you can certainly give us a nice presentation on this subject very easily. And each of us can argue with you for some time after you finish. And we're kind of hoping that that in itself will generate a synthesis that's worth sharing. The other point I want to make before I hand it over to David, who actually got us stimulated to start this when he told us we couldn't eat money, was to really get us to start sharing success stories. And as we know, we all have networks, and each of ours is quite different. We each have different backgrounds, and yet each of us is collecting neat stuff that we could easily share with each other. And we may be even getting the Club of Rome to be a facilitator or to find someone who'd like to pay to be one. And we'll talk about that one day too. But I'd again like to thank all of you for spending today with us. And we first, just by a show of hands, I guess, since everybody has, are you willing to do this again in, say, about a month's time? And we'll set something up. Just lift your hand if you are. And then that means, okay, I take it we're almost into democracy, so that means we can probably manage to pull that off. And so I'd like to thank you again. I think we've learned something from each other very much. And David is stuck with trying to wrap it all up. David.
Thank you, Ted. This has been a fascinating discussion. And I so admire Monfella and how she is giving us what to me is a very important new focus. Well, it's not entirely new, as Carlos has pointed out, but the focus on where we need to go rather than just focusing on what's going wrong. Also,
can you please?
Yeah. I'm also very, very taken by this thinking about the Club of Rome as a network of networks, because it is through the networks as they reach out to carry these conversations forward and farther and further and deeper into humanity. Because if I recall correctly,
your connection is bad.
Oh my.
Yeah.
Well, let me get close to the mic. Does that help?
Yes.
Okay. I think it was Bill Reese was pointing out that we get our mind programmed, locked into particular channels, which is part of the way we evolved. That was essential to our ability to live together as communities. And as the foundation to me, everything that Mamfella speaks to us about comes back to Ubuntu. The basic idea, I am because you are. And as I think she also makes very clear, that's not just because other humans are, even though, you know, recognizing that none of us can survive on our own. We only survive as a community. But at the deeper level, life itself depends on community. We are only because nature is. And I think the thing we need to keep coming back to, it's what I find myself continuously coming back to, is the recognition, so far as we know from the best of our science, this is the only planet we have yet identified in all the cosmos that has the conditions on its surface essential to life as we know it. And the best we know about how Earth became this way, how it developed these conditions, is because those conditions were created by life. You know, and as once you begin to get your mind around that, that is so incredibly extraordinary. And how did life do that? And when we get into the, you know, obviously there's lots of competition at life, and more complex forms of life can only exist by eating lower forms. So there's conflict involved in this, and yet the whole thing works out within this synergistic framework of the whole. That not only is our well-being dependent on the well-being of the whole and of the individuals in the whole, our very existence depends on that. And, you know, I've been thinking that in some ways we might talk about the Ubuntu principle as a foundational principle of everything. I am because we are. We in the very biggest sense. Then we get into this mental framework that we are in, exacerbated by what we teach as economics, which I think we need to rename as egonomics. It is not economics.
Very good.
And
very good.
It is ultimately deeply destructive. So what we must create is an economics, which in a sense provides us with a map to think about how do we relate to each other in ways that are consistent with the principle of Ubuntu. I am because you are, because we are. And recognizing that money can be a useful tool, but money as we have come to use it is a total distraction. Because we've actually created a reality for each of us that if we don't have any money, we're dead. Wow, that makes money really important. And yet, as I tirelessly point out, we can't eat money. Money has no existence outside of the human mind. None. There is nothing in nature. There is no equivalent to money. So it's totally our self-misdirection that creates the crisis that we're in now, chasing money and destroying life to make money. So this is all part of the fundamental shift, and I just so thank you, Mamfella. It's so extraordinary to know you and to be connected with you and to get the benefit of this wisdom. And I'm also totally taken by this amazing paper that Carlos has done with help from Mamfella, which I think takes us down to this deepest level of understanding basically of the implications of Ubuntu as we begin to rethink ourselves and our understanding of how we have to organize as living beings, recognizing that the fundamentals of the way life organizes are extraordinarily decentralized. Life adapts to the great myriad of conditions on Earth through its ability to organize locally as communities that secure the well-being of the whole, but also in relation to all of its neighboring communities so that together they create and maintain the conditions on this planet essential to our existence, but not just our existence, but to the existence of all of life as we know it.